She found them in the trash, two babies abandoned by their own mother. Years later, they became her light. But one day, the woman who had once betrayed them returned. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories. And write in the comments, which city are you from? The town was small and tight-lipped, the kind of place where laundry lines were straighter than most people's spines, and everyone knew what kind of soup their neighbor was cooking before they tasted their own. It was a town that lived on glances, on whispers passed behind hands, and on the rustling wind that carried judgment from porch to porch like pollen. The houses lined up in neat rows, each with whitewashed fences, trimmed hedges, and narrow eyes behind embroidered curtains. Here silence was currency, and shame, once sparked, moved faster than fire in dry grass. In a white house with green shutters on the corner of Maple and Ash, Caroline lived beneath the weight of a legacy she had never asked to carry. Her mother, Ruth, was a woman of few words and iron routines. Every morning the windows were scrubbed until they gleamed, the drapes pulled back so the neighbors could see that nothing improper ever happened behind those glass panes. Every movement was measured, every reaction rehearsed. Caroline had been raised to be perfect in posture and speech, not for herself, but for what her image meant to the family. A wrong glance could bring dishonor. A rumor could undo a reputation crafted over generations. Caroline used to believe she could endure it, that she could disappear inside the life mapped out for her. Church choir, polite smiles, marriage to someone her mother deemed appropriate. But when she met Micah, none of that had seemed real anymore. He had come through town one summer working on the road crew, his skin the color of fresh earth, his laughter warm and alive in ways her home had never been. Their time together had been brief, hidden behind the chapel and beneath the old water tower, where even the birds seemed to hush. Then he was gone, and Caroline was left with a silence and a body that began to change, in ways she could not hide for long. When her mother saw the truth taking shape beneath her blouses, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply folded her arms in the kitchen doorway and told Caroline she had shamed them all. Her father said nothing. He just stared into his plate like the answers to life were buried in mashed potatoes. After that, Caroline walked the streets of the town like a ghost, eyes down, stomach wrapped in scarves that grew tighter by the week. It didn't matter. The people knew. Their eyes darted to her belly in the market. Their mouths curled slightly before they turned away. And when they did speak, it was in phrases like, "Poor Ruth," or "Did you hear about Caroline?" As if she were already a headline, a lesson, a warning. By the time the heat of summer had deepened into the sticky thickness of June, Caroline was moving slower, her hands trembling even when they were still. She had not spoken Micah's name in months. She told herself the children, though she hadn't known it was twins, would be her redemption. That once they were born, she could love them and become something other than a disappointment. That maybe love could wash away shame, but shame has roots, and they had taken hold in her bones. When her water broke, it wasn't dramatic. There was no rush of people, no panic. Just a quiet gasp in her bedroom, a pair of pants hastily pulled on, in the silent car ride to the hospital, her mother driving with lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. At the clinic, the nurse barely looked up as she was checked in. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and resignation. In the delivery room, beneath the fluorescent lights that buzzed like hornets, Caroline felt her body tearing itself apart. She clenched her teeth, not from the pain, but from the knowledge that this was it, the end of everything she had known and the beginning of what she could not imagine. When the babies were born, there was a moment of stillness. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that settles in just before a storm. The nurse stared. The doctor cleared his throat. No one said anything at first. Then as the twins were cleaned and wrapped in thin white hospital blankets, Caroline noticed something strange in their silence. When she finally looked, her breath caught. The babies were beautiful, perfect, their tiny hands curled like seashells, their lips trembling with the first wails of life. But their skin was deep, rich brown. There was no mistaking it. There was no room for excuses or explanations. And in that moment, every fragile hope she had clung to shattered. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The nurse said something under her breath and avoided Caroline's gaze. The doctor placed the babies in the bassinet rather than her arms. She watched as they squirmed slightly, their cries thinning into exhausted whimpers. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, but her body refused to move. The next days were a haze of white walls and hollow voices. She remained in bed, turned to the wall. The nurses fed and changed the babies. Her mother came once, looked at the children and then at Caroline, and left without a word. Her father did not come at all. The room felt colder with each passing hour. The shame grew like mold in her chest, coating her lungs until she couldn't breathe without tasting bitterness. She began to think of the town, of the stares, the whispers, the snide comments masked as concern. She imagined trying to walk through the market with the babies in her arms, hearing the quiet click of tongues and watching people cross the street to avoid her. She imagined her mother disowning her, her father cutting her off. She imagined never being able to work, to be seen, to belong anywhere again. She imagined the girls growing up with the same hatred carved into their skin that had been carved into hers. But worse, because of what they looked like, because of what people would say. And so the thought crept in, first as a whisper, then a scream. She tried to push it away, but it stayed, settled in her chest, made itself at home. One night before the dawn had fully broken, she dressed quietly. The hospital hallway was empty, dimly lit. The nurse on duty had dozed off, a magazine slipping from her lap. Caroline stood at the doorway to the nursery, looking at the two small bundles. She hesitated. Her hand hovered over the edge of one blanket. One of the babies stirred, tiny fingers grasping the air, brushing against her skin. The warmth of that touch was unbearable. It felt like fire. It felt like forgiveness, and she couldn't accept either. She gathered them both in her arms, barely breathing. The hallway stretched ahead of her like a tunnel with no end. Outside, the air was thick with humidity and the scent of wet asphalt. She walked fast, the babies against her chest, their breaths shallow and even. They didn't know. They couldn't know. The town was asleep. She moved like a shadow along the edges of fences, across alleys, toward the industrial district where old buildings slouched under broken roofs. She stopped at a dumpster behind a half-collapsed warehouse. The metal lid groaned as she opened it. The smell hit her like a wave. She sobbed, biting her fist to stifle the sound. The babies stirred, small cries emerging, fragile and insistent. She placed them inside, one whimpered. The other blinked up at her. Caroline slammed the lid shut, leaning against it, pressing her forehead to the rusted metal. Her tears fell in silence. Her hands trembled. Her heart screamed. She turned and ran, not stopping until her breath was gone and her feet burned. She did not look back. She could not. The rain began to fall as she boarded the bus that would take her away. Her hair clung to her face, her coat soaked through. She sat near the back, staring out the window, watching the town vanish behind her. She told herself it was over, that she could start again, that the pain would fade. But as the engine rumbled and the town disappeared into mist, she felt something cold settle deep inside her, something that would not leave, no matter how far she traveled. Something that sounded like two small voices crying in the dawn, calling out for a world that had turned away. The bus roared into the distance, and the town resumed its stillness, unaware of what had been left behind. The rain had softened to a mist that clung to the cracked sidewalks and glistened on rusted rooftops. The alley behind the old warehouse, with its peeling paint and broken bricks, remained silent save for the faintest cries rising from within the green metal dumpster near the crumbling fence. The world did not stop to notice. Cars rolled by on the main road. A stray dog scratched at its ear beneath a flickering street lamp, and in the distance the dull clang of metal echoed through the alleyways. Loretta was already awake, as she was most mornings before the sun had properly risen. She sat on the edge of her thin mattress, wrapped in a faded shawl that once belonged to her mother. The room around her was small and worn, its floor sagging in places, its roof patched with sheet metal and old tarps. Rainwater leaked through a corner, dripping steadily into a bucket she had placed the night before. The smell of damp wood and old fabric filled the space. It was not much, but it was home. And for Loretta, home had always been less about walls and more about memory. She moved slowly, pulling on her boots, rubbing warmth into her knees before standing. Her bones ached more now than they had a year ago, but she did not complain. Complaints did not feed the belly or patch the roof. She stepped outside into the soft drizzle, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the narrow path behind the scrapyard. The town's edge was quiet, and Loretta preferred it that way. She had lived a life full of noise once, laughter from school cafeterias where she worked, music from the radio as her son helped her with laundry, the bubbling chatter of neighbors at the church picnics. That was before the accident, before the phone call, before everything went quiet all at once. Her cart squeaked as she pulled it behind her, its wheels worn thin from years of use. She moved past the back fences of shops, the old church parking lot, the cracked pavement that led toward the industrial zone. This route was familiar. People threw away things they shouldn't: wire, broken radios, aluminum scraps. And Loretta had learned to find value where others saw trash. It had kept her going when the rest of the world seemed to move on without her. The rain grew heavier as she turned the corner near the old warehouse. Her boots splashed through shallow puddles, her breath misting in the morning air. She adjusted her grip on the cart, ready to lift the lids of the dumpsters one by one, just as she had done for years. But as she reached the third bin, something stopped her. A sound, not metal, not wind. A cry, soft, fragile, human. Loretta froze, heart thudding in her chest. She leaned closer, the rain matting her curls to her forehead, and listened. The cry came again, faint but unmistakable. Her fingers, stiff with cold, grasped the edge of the rusted lid and heaved it open. The hinges groaned. Inside, beneath a hospital blanket soaked through with rainwater, were two tiny forms. Their eyes squeezed shut, their mouths open in silent, exhausted wails. Their skin, dark and glistening, was too familiar to her, not because she had known them, but because she had known loss. She had held her own baby once, just like this, wrapped in a blanket, warm and full of breath, until he wasn't. Loretta's knees gave slightly as she leaned into the bin. She reached out, her hands trembling, and lifted one baby, then the other, cradling them against her chest. They were so light, so breakable. Their cries softened as they pressed against her warmth, their tiny fingers grasping at her shawl. Rain fell against her cheeks, mixing with tears she hadn't expected. She stood there for a moment, holding them, letting the weight of the moment settle into her chest. No note, no explanation. Just two children discarded like scraps. Rage flared in her throat, followed quickly by sorrow, but there was no time to waste. She tucked the babies inside her shawl, one against each side of her chest, and covered them as best she could. The rain was cold, the air colder, and their skin was already chilled. She pushed the cart aside and moved as quickly as her legs allowed, retracing her path through the alley, past the iron fence, through the lot behind her home, and into the narrow doorway. Inside, she set them gently on the mattress, lighting the oil lamp with fingers that shook more now from urgency than age. The light flickered across the peeling wallpaper and danced in the reflection of the tiny eyes now blinking up at her. She peeled away the wet blankets and swaddled them in old towels, whispering words of comfort she hadn't spoken in years. She heated water in a dented kettle, mixing powdered milk she had stored for her tea. The bottle she used was old, but she cleaned it thoroughly, warming the rubber nipple over the fire. The babies drank slowly, their mouths unsure, their bodies still racked with shivers. She fed them one after the other, wiping the milk from their chins with cloth strips torn from an old sheet. That night, Loretta did not sleep. She sat beside the mattress, watching their chests rise and fall, listening to their breath. She did not know where they had come from. She did not know who had left them or why. She only knew that they were hers now, not by blood, but by bond, by need. In the days that followed, Loretta adjusted her world to revolve around them. She gave them names: Zaya, for light; Noah, for peace. She whispered their names like prayers as she bathed them in warm water, wrapped them in layers of shirts and fabric, and held them against her chest to share her body heat. When their cries echoed through the night, she walked the length of the small room, singing songs she thought she had forgotten. She cleaned and cooked with one strapped to her front and the other in a makeshift basket by her side. She returned to the alley only when she had no choice, pulling the cart with one hand, keeping the other free to shield the babies from wind or stares. The neighbors noticed. Some offered silence. Others offered side glances and muttered comments. But Loretta kept her head high. There were visits to the clinic, long hours spent begging for medicine when the girls caught their first fever. She offered to scrub floors, wash windows, anything in exchange for antibiotics and advice. A nurse named Darla, who had once been a student in the school where Loretta worked, took pity and helped quietly, slipping bottles into her coat and whispering instructions. Food was scarce. On many nights, Loretta gave up her own meals so the babies could eat. Her belly grumbled as she sat on the floor, rocking them to sleep. Hunger became her silent companion, but she did not complain. She had made her choice, and she had never regretted it. The twins grew stronger. Their cheeks filled out. Their eyes followed her as she moved. When they smiled, something inside Loretta shifted. Something that had been frozen since the funeral, since the casket, since the silence of her old life had wrapped itself around her. She found herself humming again, talking to the girls as she worked, laughing when they laughed. There were hard days, cold nights when the firewood was gone and the wind slipped through the cracks in the wall. Days when Noah cried without reason or Zaya refused to eat. Days when Loretta doubted herself, when exhaustion bent her shoulders and made her hands shake. But there were bright moments too. Zaya's first laugh, Noah's first grasp, the way they reached for her when she entered the room. The warmth of their small bodies curled beside her at night, the rhythm of their breathing, the sense that somehow, despite everything, they had found each other. Loretta kept a small notebook where she recorded their milestones, writing with a dull pencil and tight cursive. She didn't have much paper, but she used every inch. First smile, first tooth, first time sleeping through the night. She had no camera, no visitors, but the memories were real. They were hers. By the time the girls were sitting up on their own, pulling themselves to their knees, babbling with determination, Loretta had woven them into the fabric of her life. She no longer thought of herself as a woman alone. She was a mother again. And in the quiet of the shed, beneath the leaking roof and next to the flickering lamp, a family had taken root in the soil of abandonment and love. Outside, the town went on, unaware, unconcerned. The people who might have whispered about a woman raising twins that didn't look like her had long stopped watching. But Loretta knew. She knew the story that had led the babies to her doorstep. She saw the weight they would carry, the questions they would one day ask. And though she did not have the answers, she promised herself one thing. She would never let them feel discarded, not in her home, not in their hearts, not in the light she saw in their eyes each morning as they woke and reached for her with the only word they knew, warmth. And so the rain came and went. The seasons shifted, the babies grew, and Loretta, who once believed her life had ended in grief, discovered in the soft heartbeat of their presence that sometimes, after everything has turned to ash, the first sign of light is not a blaze, but a breath. The seasons turned as they always did, without asking permission, without waiting for anyone to catch their breath. The cold gave way to mud, and mud to wildflowers poking up between sidewalk cracks, then back to heat, to sweat dampening the collar of Loretta's dress as she pushed her cart through town with a baby strapped to her chest and another on her hip. The twins grew, and the house adjusted around them. What had once been a space for solitude slowly transformed into a rhythm of two new lives learning how to exist. With each month, the shed evolved, blankets arranged more carefully, scraps gathered not only for sale but for use, every corner repurposed to accommodate the growing needs of Zaya and Noah. Loretta moved with purpose. She woke before dawn to prepare bottles, to light the stove, to count the remaining coins and stretch them across days that never seemed short enough. Some mornings she felt the ache in her hands before she opened her eyes. Some nights her dreams were filled with the echo of cries and the low hum of lullabies. And yet beneath the fatigue, she carried something deeper than weariness, something she had thought she'd buried years ago. Purpose. She had no illusions about the world. It had failed her before. But these girls were hers, and they would be raised with dignity, no matter what the world said they did or did not deserve. By the time they turned 5, Zaya and Noah were different in every way, yet inseparable in their orbit around Loretta. Zaya was all fire, with quick hands and quicker curiosity. She loved the softness of fabric, the colors of ribbons and buttons, the texture of threads pulled loose and wound around her fingers. She would sit for hours sorting scraps Loretta collected from bins behind the tailor shop, humming to herself, folding and refolding until something small emerged. A flower, a bow, a loop of ribbon twisted into something that looked almost like art. Noah, quieter by nature, was always observing. She loved lines, straight edges, patterns in the dirt, and she followed the grooves in the shed floor with her finger and copied them with a stick outside. She was always drawing on boxes, on the backs of envelopes, in the condensation of window panes. Her shapes became houses, her houses became dreams. They started school late because Loretta didn't trust the world to handle them kindly. But she relented when she saw how hungry they were to learn, not just their letters and numbers, but what it meant to be among others, to walk into rooms not meant for them and make space anyway. She scrubbed their uniforms by hand each night, brushing the hems clean with water drawn from the pump down the road. The clothes were worn, their shoes scuffed and secondhand, but they went to school each morning with heads high and eyes bright. The world, however, was not as generous. At school, the girls encountered children who had heard their parents whisper things they didn't understand, but repeated with cruel precision. Words like illegitimate and abandoned slithered into conversations during lunch or recess. Noah returned home more silent than usual, her fingers tracing tighter lines into the corners of notebooks Loretta found discarded by the garbage bins. Zaya began folding the same piece of cloth over and over again, her brow furrowed, her jaw clenched. Loretta watched and said little. Instead, she sat beside them and told them stories of women who walked through fire, of men who built homes from mud, of people who the world had tried to forget, but who carved out space anyway, with their hands, with their will, with their names. She showed them how to find pride, not in perfection, but in persistence. As the years passed, the twins began to help with the small tasks that had once fallen entirely on Loretta's shoulders. Noah helped sort wires at the scrapyard, learning how to distinguish between copper and aluminum by sight. Zaya learned to cut fabric with even strokes and practiced threading needles with her grandmother's precision. On weekends, they set up a small mat in the corner of the marketplace, near the fishmonger and the woman who sold fruit preserves. There they laid out their handmade hair ties in small cloth pouches, stitched by Zaya and dyed with colors they mixed from leftover pigment powders that Loretta had bartered for. Noah kept a small notepad where she listed prices, counted coins, and sketched improvements to their layout for the next market day. At first, people passed by without stopping, but curiosity is persistent, especially when paired with beauty. The items the girls offered were simple, but they were neat, carefully made, and offered with a grace that softened even the hardest glances. An older woman bought a pouch one day and returned the next weekend to ask for another. A school teacher commented on the quality of the stitching. A vendor offered to share his umbrella space during heavy rains. Slowly, what had been an experiment became a rhythm. The mat, the display, the sales, it became part of their lives. Back at home, their coin jar under the floorboards grew heavier. Each clink of a new coin was met with a small nod from Loretta, who kept count in her head but never touched the money. It was theirs, for something better, for something ahead. Zaya began to dream bigger. She sketched outfits in the margins of newspapers. She asked Loretta about collars, hems, seams. She began sewing miniature garments for dolls she'd found discarded. Some of them she gave away to children in the neighborhood. Noah continued designing structures, roofs that sloped for water collection, windows angled to catch the breeze. She talked about designing homes for women like Loretta, for people who lived with holes in their ceilings and soft spots in their floors. She dreamed of space, light, warmth. Their talents did not go unnoticed for long. A local tailor saw Zaya's work and offered to let her spend afternoons at the shop, learning how to measure, cut, and fit properly. She came home each evening with fingers pricked from needles and a heart swelling with purpose. Noah found part-time work at a building supply shop, carrying materials, organizing tools, in talking to contractors who, over time, began to share their old blueprints with her. She brought them home like treasure, spreading them across the floor of the shed and tracing every line. Loretta watched all this with the tired eyes of someone who had once believed the best chapters of her life had already been written. But in the rise and fall of her girls' shoulders, in the way their hands moved with skill and their eyes sparkled with conviction, she saw a new chapter unfolding, one she had not expected to live long enough to witness. They continued to sell on weekends, their little corner of the market gaining regulars. Loretta sat behind them sometimes in her old chair with a cushion she had sewn herself, watching customers admire Zaya's craftsmanship or ask Noah about custom-sized bags. Their brand, as modest as it was, now had a name. Zaya had written it on a scrap of cloth and pinned it to their mat. Grace Light. Loretta hadn't asked them what it meant, but the first time she saw it, her throat closed and her eyes brimmed. On days when it rained too hard to sell, or when hunger made concentration impossible, they worked at home. Zaya mended old clothes to practice stitching. Noah redrew her blueprints on fresher pages. They wrapped themselves in old blankets near the stove, sipping tea when they could afford it and whispering plans for what they would do when they had enough money for a real shop. One with a front window, a door that opened onto the market, a place where Loretta could sit without worrying about leaks in the ceiling. But even with their progress, the world did not always yield. There were days Zaya returned home with tears in her eyes after a customer dismissed her work as overpriced or unworthy. Days when Noah's fingers were scraped raw from lifting more than her body could bear. Loretta tended to their wounds quietly, with warm cloths and soft prayers, never saying much, but always present. They celebrated birthdays with bread and laughter. They measured their success in small victories. The day they saved enough to buy a second-hand sewing machine. The day a customer returned with a friend. The day Noah's drawing won a community art contest. Each step was its own kind of miracle. At night, as the city quieted, they sat together in the shed that had once been Loretta's retreat from grief. It had no insulation, no paint, no lock on the door, but it had warmth. From the fire, from the girls. From something Loretta had stopped believing in and had found again, not through sermons or books or long-forgotten friends, but through two tiny bodies placed in her arms by fate and raised with every ounce of strength she had left. In the hush before sleep, they often made promises that they would keep going, that they would take care of Loretta, that they would open their shop, that they would build homes. And each time they whispered those dreams aloud, Loretta listened with her eyes closed, her hands resting in her lap, and her heart open to the quiet wonder of what they were becoming. It was not the life she had expected, but it was the life she had chosen. And in that choice, brick by brick, stitch by stitch, coin by coin, they were building something that would outlast poverty and silence and shame. They were building something strong, something sacred, something their hands had crafted and their hearts had named family. The early mornings had become a sacred time, a quiet ritual that unfolded before the market stirred. The air was crisp, the light pale as it filtered through the gaps in the shed's patched roof. Inside, the rhythm of life was steady and sure. Zaya bent over the sewing machine with precise movements, her fingers guiding each seam with the care of someone who understood that every thread mattered. Noah, already dressed and hair braided, sat cross-legged near the stove, sketching a shelf design for the market stall on the back of an old sales receipt. Loretta, older now and walking more slowly, moved about with a grace shaped by years of repetition and resilience, boiling water for tea and folding the girls' clean uniforms with her worn but steady hands. Everything had purpose. Everything had place. The coin tin under the floor was heavier now, its contents grown from years of weekend sales, evening commissions, and careful saving. The girls had matured into young women with shoulders that no longer hunched in uncertainty and eyes that met the world with quiet defiance. Grace Light had become more than just a name on a handmade sign. It was a presence in the market. Customers returned not just for the quality of the cloth bags and the simple beauty of Zaya's embroidery, but for the warmth of the stall itself, for the way the sisters worked together with ease, the way their joy hummed through the space like background music. Vendors had begun to nod when the girls arrived in the morning, and a few even set aside scraps of fabric or unused buttons for Zaya, while Noah was regularly offered old cardboard tubes and measuring tape from builders packing up. Respect had replaced pity, not loudly, not formally, but in the way eyes met theirs now, in the way people made space for them in the heart of the market, in the way others began to imitate their setup, their signage, their style. Loretta watched it all from her usual chair beside the stall, wrapped in her shawl, her hands folded quietly on her lap. She no longer needed a guide. Her work had been done, and it showed in the way the girls carried her legacy without her prompting. The dream of their own shop, once just a whisper shared in the darkness between sisters, had begun to take shape as something real. They had found a small space vacant and dusty but solid just steps from the marketplace. Its windows were cracked and its walls stained, but Zaya saw where the curtains would hang, and Noah saw how the doorframe could be reinforced and painted white. They spoke of it constantly, heads bent together in the evenings over bread and tea, scribbling budgets and designs into their shared notebook. They would name it Grace Light, like the stall, but this time it would have a front door. This time it would be theirs. It was during one of those early market mornings, while Zaya was arranging the display and Noah was recording inventory, that she appeared. A woman with gray streaks in her blonde hair, her shoulders hunched from years of hard living, her hands wrapped tightly around the handle of an empty shopping basket. Her clothes were clean but faded, her shoes worn nearly through at the soles. She moved from stall to stall, asking softly, almost inaudibly, whether there was any work to do. A sweep to be made, something to lift, anything that might earn her a coin or a bite to eat. Most ignored her. A few shook their heads, eyes sliding past her. She didn't beg. She simply waited a moment before moving on, face lined not just with time, but with something more deeply carved, regret. When she reached the Grace Light stall, she hesitated. The girls looked up at her. She asked if they needed help, her voice catching mid-sentence, as if unsure whether she deserved to be heard. Zaya, already holding a small broom she used to tidy their space each morning, paused. Noah looked at her sister and then back at the woman, a silent exchange passing between them. They handed her the broom and offered a piece of bread from their lunch bundle without a word. The woman took it with trembling hands, her eyes blinking quickly, and turned away slightly to eat. She did not speak further that day, and when her work was done, she simply nodded and walked off. But she returned. The next day and the next, always before the market had fully come alive, offering her help again, always quiet, always unsure, always watching them with an intensity that felt just shy of familiar. Loretta noticed her first. She watched the woman's face as she swept, saw how her eyes lingered on the girls, how her hands sometimes hovered just inches from the fabric on display before she pulled them back. She said nothing, not at first. It was the baker's wife, one of the oldest sellers in the market, who brought the past crashing into the present. She was talking to Loretta, as she often did, reminiscing about old times. Her words drifted lazily until she paused and said, "She reminds me of that girl, the one who disappeared years ago. The one they whispered about. Remember? The one who had twins and left town? Can't recall her name. Caroline, maybe." The name hung in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Loretta said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the teacup she held. That evening, as they packed up the stall and walked home under the lavender sky, Zaya and Noah both spoke at once. They had seen the woman watching them, had felt something in her presence that unsettled them. They had questions they had carried in the quiet places of their minds for years. Questions that had no faces until now. The truth had been buried gently all this time, not to deceive, but to protect. But the time for silence had passed. Back at the shed under the soft glow of the lantern, Loretta told them. She told them about the morning she had found them in the dumpster, about the rain, about the cries that led her to them. She told them about their condition, about the blankets soaked through, about how their warmth had nearly slipped away before she pulled them to her chest. She told them she didn't know who had left them, but that someone had, someone who had walked away. She told them she didn't care who that person had been. She told them they were hers. The girls sat in silence. Not empty silence, but heavy, full. And then Zaya reached for Noah's hand, and they both reached for Loretta's. And nothing more was said that night. The next morning, they set up the stall as usual. The woman came, and this time, they saw her clearly. Caroline stood at the edge of the stall, her body still drawn in, her eyes full of something desperate, something halfway between fear and longing. She did not speak. Neither did they. Zaya handed her the broom, Noah offered her a piece of fruit, and she stayed. In the days that followed, the unspoken space between them grew thinner. Caroline worked quietly, folding fabric, sweeping corners, carrying baskets to the cart. She never asked for money. She never lingered too long. But she returned each day, and the girls, without saying so, began to expect her. One evening, after the sun had dipped low and the market had emptied, Loretta brought out a fourth teacup and set it on the small table beside the stall. She poured hot water and offered it to Caroline, who stared at it as if it were something sacred. She sat. They drank in silence, the air between them filled with the chirp of crickets and the rustle of canvas canopies in the breeze. Caroline's hands trembled around the cup. Her shoulders sagged with the weight of the years. And then, with a voice hoarse from disuse, she began to speak. She told them everything, of the shame, of the fear, of the judgment that closed in on her like a vice, of the way she had believed the whispers that said she was ruined, that her babies were a curse, that she had no future unless she erased them. She told them of the years spent running, of the jobs lost, of the nights spent awake wondering what became of the cries she left behind in the rain. She did not beg. She did not expect. She simply told the truth. And when her voice broke, when the cup rattled in her hands from the shaking, it was Noah who reached across the table and steadied her fingers. It was Zaya who said softly, that pain does not disappear, but it can be repurposed. That night under the stars, forgiveness was not declared, but allowed. Caroline continued to help them, learning slowly how to stitch from Zaya, watching how Noah measured lines with care. Loretta guided her gently, not as a mother to daughter, but as one woman to another who had suffered, endured, and chosen to stay. The past did not vanish. But it no longer hovered like a threat. It simply existed, acknowledged and set down. When the shop finally opened, painted bright, with clean windows and hand-sewn curtains that fluttered in the morning breeze, it bore a new version of the old sign, Grace Light. Caroline stood behind the counter beside the sisters who had once been her daughters only by blood, and had now become her mirror and her mercy. Customers came and stayed. The shop became a place of warmth, of stories, of healing. Not everyone knew its beginning, but everyone could feel its heart. And Loretta, seated in the chair beneath the front window, wrapped in her old shawl, watched the world walk in and out, and knew without question that this was what it meant to rise from ashes, not with fire, but with light. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos to discover even more powerful journeys, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.